You're listening to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Two fans, two generations, all things Star Wars begins now.
All right, well, hello, everybody. I'm Eric Vansel.
And I'm Daryl Sanders.
And we're your hosts for this show, of course, that's happening on Monday. Of course, it's happening an hour later than what we usually do because, once again, work rears its ugly head. But we're here. We're live. And we're ready to chat with you guys. And we're ready to chat with you guys both on YouTube and over on Twitch. Again, it's been a minute since we've started streaming again on Twitch. It hasn't been that long, and already we have some followers over there, and we have some people that chat in, so we want to take the time to welcome all of our friends on Twitch. Sometimes it almost sounds like we're a little YouTube-centric, but we do love our Twitch followers, too, and we really appreciate you guys who are watching us on Twitch. So yeah, tonight, again, we're doing this whole Journey to Ahsoka thing, and of course, Friday, this is great. We already know what we're talking about and everything. This Friday is part 1 of our Journey to Ahsoka, and then Monday will be part 2 to our Journey to Ahsoka, and then Ahsoka.
Mm-hmm.
It debuts a week from Wednesday?
It's the 23rd.
Yeah.
It's the 23rd. Yep.
Yeah. So I think it's a week from Wednesday. So, we're really excited about that, of course. And one of the things that we're doing in this whole journey up to Ahsoka is we started going back and forth about, I remember you had the idea of, hey, let's start comparing Jedi, like Master and Apprentice. We'll take certain pairs or whatever and compare them and try to determine, well, who really out of the two of them was the best. And so I remember when we were producing on the fly a little bit on Friday, we decided, you know what? Let's just dedicate tonight's episode to Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon. Because the interesting thing about these guys, there's a lot of directions we can go. There's a lot of discussion that we can have with you guys watching us right now. Of course, people who are maybe watching the rebroadcast, a lot of people commenting in. We've had some really good discussions on people commenting in, and of course, if you want to carry it over to our Discord, we basically have our Discord server, so you can carry the conversation over there if you want to as well. But these guys, there was that whole book, which I think is the only one that you and I reviewed on this show, which was called Master and Apprentice. And it basically chronicled sort of those really rough beginning years of Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon. And the other thing that I like about these two in particular is that they each have a very unique way of achieving what they achieve. Qui-Gon's a little bit more loose with the rules. He's a little bit more intuition-based, I guess. And then Obi-Wan's a little bit more by the book. So, I don't know. What were you actually thinking? Because you're the one that came up with this whole thing. And by the way, David chats in and says, it's Star Wars Day. Yes, it is, David. And actually, let me just go ahead, because I didn't have time to do this earlier. Yeah, okay, cool. I have to make sure the chat works. Usually I do that before we go on, but yeah, man. That's right. Every Monday and Friday, it's Star Wars Day for us, so what were you thinking, basically, when you came up with this whole thing?
Well, the thing is that, the show's been around for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
And, we often bring up the fact that, a lot of times we agree, which is fine. That's always good to have peace and harmony. However,
it is true that this thing is called head-to-head, and very rarely do we really go head-to-head. It's basically just kind of a love fest. But, yeah.
So
I hear what you're saying.
In the spirit of things, in a way.
Are you trying to generate conflict here? Is that it?
Well, slightly. But I also feel like, there's a great discussion because, when you look at the specs of, and I have to kind of make it seem like they're pieces of equipment or whatever, but when you look at the attributes, maybe that's the better term, of both of these characters, it's it's very interesting because you have it's almost like, in our own lives, like, with our own parents. Sometimes we take on traits of our parents that, are very much them, and then sometimes we don't like certain traits about them, so we go to completely the opposite direction. And that a lot of times affects the way that we as children or what have you um deal with the world.
Isn't
And
that kind of
sometimes our parents don't
strange?
understand that.
I mean, when
Yeah.
you really stop and think about it, and this just occurs to me, and certainly, look, this applies to the Jedi that we're comparing too, and that is when you're dealing with your parents, and if you guys look at your own lives with your own parents, and this is true 90%, I mean, sure, somebody could probably chat in and say, well, for me, it's a little bit different. But for most people, I think it is true. I think we do either, we kind of look at our parents and we're either a lot alike in a lot of ways with
Hmm.
them. And then there's other times
Hmm.
where it's like completely the opposite, right? There's
Yes.
usually no real middle ground. And yeah, that's a really good observation. And in fact, that's also true, I think, in the whole master apprentice relationship in the Jedi, too, is that a lot of
Hmm.
times the apprentice is looking at their master and they're saying, okay, these are the things that are working. And then these are the things that I don't know. I think that it could be better, or maybe they can improve it in some way. And then, of course, another thing, continuing on with your analogy, of course, is that with the parents, what are we always saying as kids? Well, I'm gonna do it better. I'm gonna be better than them, in some way. And of
Hmm.
course,
Well, I'm
it,
not going to do this when I get older.
right, yeah, exactly. Well, I'll
Hmm.
never do this to my kid or whatever. And sometimes it's true, and sometimes, of course, that's just the whole development and growth process. And once you actually get experience, wisdom, knowledge, and all that stuff, you do exactly the same thing because you understand why your parents did what they did. But in
Hmm.
the sense of maybe you do try to grow beyond them, if the parents are having the right kind of attitude, generally speaking, they want that. They encourage that. They're like, yeah, be better than me. Be the better version. That's really the goal of every parent is for their kids to move
Supersede
beyond.
them.
Yeah, pretty
Yeah.
much. Yeah, exactly.
And that's
Exactly.
kind of even in this, if you look at the Sith, that's kind of their philosophy because, their whole thing is like, okay, you don't deserve to be the master until you can beat me. So it's kind of
Yep.
like, I'm trying to raise you so you can surpass me.
Mhm.
But until you can do that, like, you got to stay in that child's place almost in a way. So with this but this combination, I think is very, because we've seen the most out of the master and apprentice combination. We've seen these two the most, in my opinion, between Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, and then of course Obi-Wan and Anakin. Like those are the
Yeah.
two ones that we
Those would be the
probably
two
are
that
more
would, yeah,
that most people are familiar with. But
right.
and we might even continue this because there are some other interesting ones as well. But
Oh, I
for
think this should
starters, to get
definitely
everyone's
be,
feet wet,
yes,
you know.
absolutely. This should be a continuing series. I mean, obviously, we're sandwiching this into this whole journey to Ahsoka thing. And I don't know, maybe in some ways, in light of that whole theme, for lack of a
Hmm.
better term, maybe we should have chosen Obi-Wan and Anakin. But I don't know, the whole Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon thing seems to be a really good launching off point. And yeah, absolutely, I think that we should continue this where we break down almost like a master versus apprentice. Maybe that's what we probably should have called this whole little thing or whatever. Ronaldo says, "Hello, my Vespa gang." He always greets us in some very unique Star Warsian way, which of course we
Yes.
appreciate. Ronaldo, it's good to have you with us. Kind of missed you Friday though. I'm not gonna lie. That was Friday, with our force power. Oh, and that reminds me. Uh, man, I think it was one of our Twitch guys. I think it was Bruce suggested that maybe we actually do our top 5 worst force powers, like the ones that we don't like. Which
Mm,
I basically said in
okay.
the comments that yeah, we'll do that because that That could actually be a fun show because there's a lot of
That could be
really
entertaining.
very entertaining, and there's a lot of really stupid force powers out there. As I was researching for, our top 5 favorites, because again, obviously the ones that we featured or whatever, at least for me, I don't know about for you. I think you said it was pretty much the same though, where basically, they just kind of came to the top of your head and you had to weight them a little bit. All right, what's number 1, what's number 5? But I did actually go on StarWars.com to try to look up some of the ones that, it's like, well, what if there's a really obscure one and we don't, we just don't remember? Like, what if I look through it and go, oh, yeah, I forgot about that one. So I want to make sure. So in light of that, there were some really stupid, useless force powers. So it would be a lot of fun. And I basically said, look, after we get through some of this Ahsoka stuff, and we got to decide how we want to handle Ahsoka too. Because as long as we're doing Star Wars twice a week on Monday and Friday, it's not a big deal. But once we do more of the general entertainment show on Friday, and then Monday is more Star Wars themed, it's like, all right, well, we got to figure out, if you got a show that we're reviewing, you can't just that be the only thing, right? So I don't know. We'll have to look at that, but that's definitely going to be on deck probably for once the whole Ahsoka thing's over, or maybe, Ahsoka's on Friday and that could be on Monday. I kind of like doing the top whatever on Mondays. It's kind of fun. So maybe we'll do that. But yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think that the choice was good to do Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon. And I think it's something that everybody that's watching right now, and then certainly everybody watching on the rebroadcast, are going to have a lot of fun with. So, I don't know, without further ado, what are your, I'll let you start. What a guy, right?
I know, right?
Well, I mean, this was your idea. I mean, it's only fair, right? I mean, never let it be said that I'm not gracious and I acquiesce.
So in my opinion, I'm going to go with Qui-Gon. I'm going to say that Qui-Gon was probably the better Jedi between the two. Simply because I think there's a lot more depth to his character. I think there's a lot of experience that comes with his character. And even though Obi-Wan, within his own right, did gain a whole lot of experience, between, having to take over the responsibilities of basically raising Anakin and all the different missions that were going on. I mean, he was basically on the onset of the Clone Wars. He had to go through that. And then, of course, on top of that, having to not only deal with Anakin, but then also partially dealing with Luke to a certain degree. So he's had his definitely trials and tribulations as far as being a instructor, mentor. But I think what sells it for me with Qui-Gon is the fact that he started to understand, and he got wise to the fact that we're holding on too tight.
Right.
And I think he learned that from Dooku. Like he kind of, because
definitely. Now,
Dooku was.
I have to just interrupt you for a second. Is that you're definitely, or there's a couple of things I want to say first, because I don't want to break your train of thought too much here. But number one, I think one of the important things that we have to focus on with Qui-Gon is Qui-Gon would like this channel. Qui-Gon would hit the like button. He's the type of guy that, Obi-Wan's a little bit more by the book, right? He would want to see the whole thing or whatever. But Qui-Gon, he's the guy that would smash that like button. And I think you guys, right now watching this, should follow Qui-Gon's example and hit that like button. Because, who wouldn't, right? But,
Right.
the other thing, though, is you're starting to reference a little bit the whole Master and Apprentice book when you start to get into the Dooku and all that stuff, which is good because I think that that's something that we, that should be pointed out and certainly does expand his character. So, yeah, I would agree that, you're kind of going into what was oh man, I totally can't remember right now. It was like some text or something, like Dooku. It was some mystical. What the heck? What was that? Where he was trying to like learn something in the Force or something that Dooku was entertaining. I don't think it was anything from the dark side, although it could have been. You know what I'm talking about?
Well, I do know that,
Like
I
at
don't know
all?
exactly to what you're referencing at this very moment, but
Even
I
though you
do
read the
recall
book
though.
too.
I
Oh, it was
did,
something,
but
man. It was like, I don't know, some
I know
mystical
he
thing
was.
or something.
Well, there was this whole thing about that's where the whole prophecy thing came from.
Oh, that was
So
it.
if
Yeah,
that's
that's
what you're
what I'm
talking
talking
about,
about. Yes,
okay,
that is what
yeah,
I'm talking about. I'm talking about the whole prophecy
okay,
thing.
yeah. And Count Dooku was kind of the one who was sort of spearheading that because they kind of almost became like kind of detectives in a way because um Qui-Gon was kind of looking for all these he was reading these books, he was going to Jocasta Nu trying to find more information because one, he wanted to please his master, so he was like, okay, if I could find more information on this, my master Count Dooku would be pleased and you know
Yep.
things like that. So but Count Dooku he was definitely a rebel in his own right, even so much so that he eventually was seduced to the dark side.
Yeah, he was a
But
little bit too much. See, that's where Qui-Gon was a little bit better, right? Qui-Gon he definitely had a lot of Dooku's, going against the council, pretty much doing what he knew was right, not necessarily what was, because the council could be a lot, pretty legalistic a lot of times. Whereas, he was actually looking at what was right for that situation. And definitely, yes, he got that from Dooku, no question. But Dooku obviously got a little bit
well,
disillusioned with the Jedi, and he ended up being seduced by the dark side, and we know what happened to him.
yeah, and I think with Qui-Gon, he was somewhat of a pacifist in a way where he didn't necessarily always want to fight. Like he wasn't just running into like how Anakin is. Anakin's always looking kind of for the squabble, but Qui-Gon is a little bit more like, okay, let's try to handle this diplomatically and try to use our cunningness and little ingenuity, if you will, to try to get around and skirt around certain situations. However, Qui-Gon being who he is and being the Padawan of Count Dooku, he was a phenomenal swordsman. He was like one of the best swordsmen in the Jedi Order. He often would duel with his former master Count Dooku, as aforementioned, and he also even took on the big dog Mace Windu a lot of times. So,
Yeah.
and we all know how powerful and good Mace Windu was. So, as a duelist, his particular style was more his lightsaber form that he kind of more or less honed was more geared towards um, lightsaber combat as opposed to some of the other forms that are dealing with like multiple opponents or blaster fire, which is more kind of what Obi-Wan's style is more kind of predicated on.
Well, Obi-Wan's got more of a well-rounded thing, in my opinion. But and again, so for me, I mean, I was going back and forth because usually I would say Qui-Gon right out the gate. And
Hmm.
I'm not just doing this for the head-to-head aspect and for this not to be a love fest, because it's a really difficult choice, to be honest. I mean, you could Qui-Gon definitely would be the popular choice. I have to say though, I'm probably going to go with Obi-Wan on this as far as, who was the best.
Okay.
But before I do that though, I want to get to these because I'm noticing our chats are getting a little bit shall we say plentiful. And unlike what a lot of YouTube shows do, because I should point this out, I like to point out the differences between our show and other shows when I can, is that a lot of times what they'll do is, they'll have the people that are discussing or whatever talk about it, and then like a hour later, they'll finally get to the chats and then they'll go back through things. Whereas with our channel, I like this to be just like a giant discussion show where it's almost like everybody who's chatting is kind of like, we're steering the ship in the conversation, but we're just all talking about this together. So I don't really like to go too long between chats. So David says, in light of the topic and the differing ideologies, do you think the Force is rigid or malleable?
Hmm.
Yeah, so here's how I'll put this. I don't necessarily think the Force is either one necessarily. I think what happens is it really depends on the Force user. Now, the will of the Force, if you want to, because look, we know that the Force a lot of times is personified, right? It'll rise people up, it'll influence certain things. It does have its own will. So, in other words, the Force is kind of its own thing with its own consciousness, and it does ultimately guide things, mostly into balance, though. And I think that this is where a lot of people get it mixed up when they're looking at Star Wars. Is a lot of people think that, it's like the good guys are always going to win kind of thing, where the Force generally seeks to put itself in balance. And oftentimes what happens, at least what we've seen in the franchise, in this little glimpse of this world, is that the Force has been out of balance because of the dark side, because the people who follow the dark side tend to try to reign supreme, as it were, generally knock the Force out of balance, so the Force pumps up the light side a little bit to meet that. But I think that, especially when you're dealing with these two guys, right, it's really more how people are using the Force in a lot of cases than the actual will of the Force itself, I would say. I mean, I don't know. You got anything to add to that?
I don't think the Force is rigid. I think it probably leans more toward a malleable type thing.
Yeah, I mean, if you're
Like you
gonna
said,
say
because
you're talking about the Force itself,
yeah,
well,
because it
yeah,
kind
I
of
mean,
it bends to the user, if you can use that. Like you said, it kind of just um takes on. I'm trying to make
well,
examples without
here's the
making a whole
thing,
lot of biblical or
but
religious
well, this
comparisons.
and that's really where you'd want to go, because that would be
Right.
I guess, the
That's
obvious
the
comparison. But even just sticking within the Star Wars universe itself of what Lucas created, don't forget that Lucas actually, when we covered the whole midi-chlorian thing, there's the cosmic force versus the personal force.
hmm
And I think what you end up finding is that the cosmic force is somewhat malleable, whereas the personal force can be malleable or rigid depending on who's using it. If you have a force user who is extremely dogmatic towards a particular philosophy within the force, right? I mean, then their use of the force becomes rigid. Maybe that's the
There
best
you
way to
go.
put
Yeah,
it.
there you
The
go.
use of the
Yeah,
force is rigid. The force itself is malleable. How about that?
there you go.
That
Because
good?
absolutely no, yeah, that's perfect. Because if you look at someone like these two, like okay, Obi-Wan is a little bit more rigid, so he's more firm and more dogmatic towards his beliefs and the structure and the way the Force should be used.
Hmm.
Qui-Gon, he's more loose with he's cash. I won't say casual, but he's a little bit more forgiving or certain things. Um, Another example would be
Circumstantial, maybe.
Ahsoka.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Ahsoka is a
Yes.
prime example because she eventually left the Jedi Order and she still is able to use the Force, but even though she's using it more towards the light side, she's using it more so to help people,
Hmm.
but she's not following the rules of the Jedi Order because remember that the Jedi is a somewhat of a religion based type organization. So it's more organizational structure as opposed to like, oh, if you're a good guy, you're a Jedi. No, that
Well, I
doesn't
would
mean that.
say I would say both the Sith and the Jedi, right? Because they're
hmm
basically the same, just opposite sides of the Force.
Yeah.
Whereas you still have, like, maybe your general Force users, whether they're using the dark side or the light side or whatever. They're
Or a
gonna fall
combination
somewhere.
thereof, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Or people that are in the middle. But I mean, there's definitely like I guess a scale, right, where
hmm
people fall generally what their uses are. But right, you're not talking about groups that are quite as dogmatic and even somewhat ritualistic as the Sith and the Jedi. But that said, I think it's also important to point out, though, that even within each of these particular disciplines, whether you're talking about the Sith or the Jedi, you still have like this wide variety of, you know, philosophies, I guess. Now, one of the things that I wouldn't mind doing a show on in the future, this would be a kind of a what if scenario, but I think that this would really be fun for our viewers and for us, is to do an entire show on what would happen if Anakin had been trained by Qui-Gon and not Obi-Wan.
Yeah, and I think that's always been the question, because everybody's, and quite frankly, I think George Lucas even said it, if I'm not mistaken,
Probably.
that had Qui-Gon lived and trained Anakin probably would have never went to the dark side.
Right. That's
And
the whole
and
reason why I
that's
want to
and
dedicate a show to it, because, obviously we've talked about it a little bit before, and obviously it comes up a little bit into this because both Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan had contact with Anakin, but I think that philosophically speaking, we can really get into the weeds with our audience on exactly what would happen and everything. That was just like a little side note, but I thought that would be fun to do. Now, Dom Chatson says, "Nah, Obi is better in my opinion."
but why?
Yeah, exactly. You gotta quantify that, man.
Explain yourself, young man.
Yes, explain yourself, my young Padawan. But Ronaldo kicks in and says, "I do agree that Obi-Wan is a better character." Now, that's still a little vague, though. But
Yes,
at
because
least
we're talking about Jedi. So
well,
are you
but
saying he's a
again,
better character as a Jedi, or just a better character, just flushed out, if I can use that? Like, are you referring to him just being a cooler character than Qui-Gon, or more well-rounded character than Qui-Gon, or you're saying that Obi-Wan is the better Jedi, like if you're looking at attribute for attribute?
right? Because that's one of the things that we're talking about now. Again, being that this is a discussion show, certainly everything is on the table here, right? I mean, it's not.
Mhm.
I mean, we're not as dogmatic as the Jedi or the Sith, right? So a lot of different, we could talk about this in a variety of ways, but I think you do have to differentiate that, though. I think you're right. I mean, we can go in either direction. I mean, if you want to talk about these two as just general characters, certainly we can include that in the discussion. But then there's also are you talking about, from a Jedi perspective? Now, Dwight rejoins us, and he basically says Kenobi also knew the Jedi were not perfect. See the Siege of Mandalore dialogue with Ahsoka as one reference. Yeah, that was actually a really pivotal Clone Wars arc, actually.
All right.
He goes on to
Dwight.
say,
Welcome back.
yeah, I know. He goes on to say, in my opinion, the Force is malleable, but those that practice in many cases are not. Yeah, that's essentially what we've been saying, is the fact that really the user is going to be the one that's going to decide how rigid or malleable it is, whereas the Force itself is just, kind of there. Ronaldo clarifies this point a little bit. He says, I mean, Obi-Wan has a better story and is better written. Okay, so I think a lot of it, though, and this is where you guys have to be a little bit careful when we're talking about these two guys, is that there's going to be a temptation to go with Obi-Wan simply because we just have more information about him. We've lived with him longer. He's appeared in more films. There's just more. He's just more entrenched in the lore, if you want to put it that way. I mean, you just know him better,
Yeah.
And so I think it's tempted to look at that and look at all the source material, because again, even if you extend this into the comics, into the novels, things like that, you're still getting more Obi-Wan than Qui-Gon at that point. I mean, really, we've only started to get a little bit more Qui-Gon with the Obi-Wan series. And we had a little bit in the Phantom Menace novel And then, of course, Master and Apprentice. If you guys haven't read the Master and Apprentice book, I do highly recommend it. In fact, if you want to go back somewhere in our channel and dig up our review of that book, it's actually pretty cool. I mean, it was a good book. In fact, what was the one? Oh man, Jedi Lost. That was the one that dealt a little bit with Dooku and Ventress.
Ventress.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. That one, to me, that's a really good companion book to the whole Master and Apprentice thing, because Master and Apprentice, even though it was really dealing with Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, it really dealt a lot with Dooku and Qui-Gon, and then there was some other Padawan he was training at the same time, and I can never remember that guy's name. But there's a whole cool story arc there. So it's worth reading for that, and you get a lot of background in that. And then, of course, Jedi Lost, which was an unfinished Clone Wars episode. And the only thing that really bothered me about it, and I remember you said the same thing because you were reading it too, is that essentially they didn't even change it. They basically kept it like a TV script. And that's exactly how it reads. It reads like a television script. So, but once you get past that, though, and you start sort of getting into the spirit of it, it's really good. And it really shows how Dooku had changed, because in Master and Apprentice, Dooku was training Qui-Gon, and he was dealing with more the Jedi side of things. And although Jedi Lost certainly flashed back to when he was a Jedi, it juxtaposed that with the more Sith Lord Dooku, and, of course, how he was dealing with Asajj. So I thought that was really cool and really interesting as well. Let me get to this one with David here. He basically says, if Obi-Wan is so by the book, how did he let Vader happen? Didn't he ignore the Elder's warnings about there being darkness in Anakin? Also, shouldn't that be a knock against him being a better Jedi? Well,
Yeah. I mean, well, to answer that, I would say this. I think what it was is that the problem with Obi-Wan was that, yes, he sensed the darkness in him, and yes, the elder statesmen, Yoda and Master Windu and all the rest of the Jedi Council really didn't want him to take on, and they didn't want to take Anakin. But Obi-Wan was like, well, I made a promise to Qui-Gon, so I have to do it. Just being a man of my word. Once again, being about the book, it's like, I'm a man of my word. So if I told him I was going to do it, I'm going to do it. So then, Yoda's like, all right, if that's what you want to do, fine. Because they didn't negate the fact that Anakin had talent. The problem was the fact that, he was too old. He already started forming his own ideals and opinions of things of life. And then on top of that, he's already been through some traumatic things growing up. So that's going to affect his judgment.
Yep.
Now,
because everybody forgets that no, that's a good point, and you shouldn't move past that, because a lot of people forget this. A lot of people forget that that's the reason why the Jedi Council, when they take on Jedi, they always go when they're infants or whatever, because the Jedi want to raise them in a very controlled environment so they can head off this stuff. But like you accurately pointed out, Anakin already had a lot of fear, a lot of anger, a lot of things because of him growing up as a slave and, all the uncertainty and with his mother and all that stuff. And then, of course, he had already formed that attachment. Whereas when you're an infant, you don't form the attachment to the mother, you form the attachment to your master, at least to the, to the Jedi in general. So these are very, very important things. And that's the reason why they were so hesitant to actually train Anakin. And again, I don't necessarily think that, Obi-Wan didn't sense it, like you were saying. I mean, I think it was just more that he... You know what it is? I'll tell you what it is. Where Obi-Wan made his mistake, and it really doesn't have anything to do with how good of a Jedi he is. It's really more that he had formed a friendship and later on a brotherhood with Anakin, and he allowed those emotions. And maybe you can hit him with that, right? Because as Jedi, you're not supposed to form these deep emotional attachments, and he sort of did that.
Well, I think the biggest downfall for Obi-Wan was two things. And one, like I said, just him. He believes so much in his master, and that's kind of the thing. It's like he formed more of the attachment to Qui-Gon, and because he felt like, okay, I wasn't there to save Qui-Gon, I wasn't there to help him. I watched him die. Like, okay, this is his last dying wish. I mean, it's very, dramatic in that sense.
Well, that's
And
true.
so he was just,
Yeah.
and then of course, he kept prattling on, like, he is the chosen one. He's, you have to do this.
Trying to
So it's
oversell
like,
it a little bit, right?
yeah, so it's like, okay, Obi-Wan's like, okay, he feels this great sense of sorrow, dread, and responsibility to all of this. And then the other part of it was the arrogance, because he even admitted in Empire, he was like, I thought I could, no, what was it, Return of the Jedi? When he's like, I thought I could train him as well as Master Yoda. I
Yep.
was wrong.
Yeah.
So it was, once again, he thought that he was like, he had arrived to a certain level that he's like, okay, you know what? I've got this. It's cool. I've had Qui-Gon, I got Yoda, I got all these guys around me. I'll be fine and I can deal with this. But it's like it was more than a notion. And that's unfortunately what ended up
Well, but you could go in a couple of different directions with this, right? Because number one, you could say, well, I mean, so just to backtrack for a second, I think that if Anakin hadn't been, let's put it this way, if he didn't fit the criteria for being the chosen one, I don't think any of this would have been in question. I think he would have just been like, yeah, sorry, kid. I mean, the reason why they ended up letting him do it wasn't because of some stupid dying promise to Qui-Gon. Although, given the fact that he was the first guy to learn to be a Force ghost, you could actually call him on it. Like, hey, I told you to train him and you didn't, right? But the thing is, that notwithstanding, you also have to look at it from a standpoint of he pretty much fit the bill as far as being the chosen one. And the Jedi Council couldn't ignore it. So as much as they knew this is a dangerous proposition, this probably isn't a good idea, maybe we really need to think about this a little bit, or maybe there's another chosen one, because that was one of the big things in episode 2, if you remember as well. And then, of course, that bled into episode 3, where they started questioning, like, when they were on that transport. Well, what if we're wrong about him being the chosen one? They were... it was so unclear to them.
Well, here's the thing is, with Anakin and Obi-Wan, that whole situation, if it wasn't for the fact that it's like, okay, this kid had the highest midi-chlorian count ever.
Well, there is that, yes.
So it's kind of like, okay, you have to look at it from this position. Would you rather have Shaquille O'Neal on your team, or go against him? I mean, unfortunately, they kind of had both, unfortunately. But in a way, it was kind of like, I would rather have the most like, he has the potential to be the most powerful Jedi who could actually lead us into the next whatever. I would rather have him over here than, okay, we let this kid go and some dark side guy senses him and trains him in the dark side. Now we have to contend with him when we could have had him. It's almost kind of like when you had, like, in the NFL or sports, when you're like, okay, man, we had a good chance of drafting this player, but we traded him to the other team. Oops. It's kind of like, you wish he would have kept that pick. No,
I mean, that makes sense.
That's kind of what happened.
But again, I think it's a lot of their uncertainty, though, because,
yeah, absolutely.
All these analogies that you're given, it's like, look, these guys are obviously very talented at what they do. And it's not, it's not quite as vague and mysterious or whatever as this whole little chosen one prophecy. To where even the Jedi Council are like, well, I don't know. It could go either way on this, because Yoda had a point, and unfortunately, not only did he have a point, he turned out to be absolutely correct, actually. He was like, listen, I mean, we can train him, but here's the thing. If we just let him go, one of two things is going to happen. Now, this is going a little bit above. This is more like the fan knowledge versus the knowledge of the people in the universe. So I got to preface that. But one of two or maybe three things is going to happen. Either Palpatine is going to sense him as a threat and have him killed because a lot of times that's what Palpatine did. If he sensed any force, this is particular true after Order 66, but it turns out this happened even a little bit before then, is that if he thought that there was a challenge to his throne or something, he basically wiped out anybody that was powerful in the Force. The second thing was, if they let him go, he may never even discover these Force powers. I think the Yoda was concerned about, look, what if we train this guy? Which is exactly what happened, by the way. What if we train this guy and, make him hyper aware of all this stuff, and we give him all this training, all this guidance, all this ability, and then he turns to the dark side? Right. Okay, we see how powerful Dooku was when that happened to him. Well, what happens if the chosen one ends up doing this? Which is why, by the way, this is like a little side note here. I really find it funny that, they were, like, Anakin had to try to hide the whole Padme relationship and then eventually the pregnancy and all that. I mean, I think that after a certain point, you would have been like, because if you think about it, that's the hope that they had, right? It was his kid that basically was trained up and eventually redeemed him / defeated him. I mean, if that hadn't happened, so, it's just food for thought.
Well, yeah, and this is why, if you really watch Phantom Menace through a different lens, this is why I look at Qui-Gon as kind of being the more superior Jedi in the situation, is because, and then this is what Obi-Wan struggled. Obi-Wan struggled enough being the apprentice of a guy who's somewhat of a maverick when he's more by the book. Then he gets another maverick that now he's trying to pull back, and it's like, okay, you're a lot like my master, but I'm trying to mold you into more of who I am. And instead of allowing him to be just who Anakin is, who Anakin is going to be. And that comes with a price, obviously, but that also brings us to an interesting thing, because oftentimes you see it where people say opposites attract, but then the same stay together, that old saying. So it's like, sometimes you look at it from the standpoint of, like, if Qui-Gon would have trained Anakin, Qui-Gon would have understood Anakin a lot more, and then Anakin probably would have never went to the dark side. But because there was always that friction a lot of times between Anakin and Obi-Wan, that's kind of the reason that was more of a loophole for Palpatine to kind of come in and manipulate Anakin even the more. Now,
yes and no. I mean, I would challenge that only in the sense of, look, because again, I really want to save a lot of that for the show where we actually focus on how Anakin would be better under Qui-Gon or maybe not. But at the same time, you talk about that friction. Don't forget, if you look at the Master and Apprentice book, there's a lot of friction between Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, too. It was very much the same as Obi-Wan and Anakin. Of course, it was flip-flopping, right? Because, now the by-the-book guy is the Master instead of the Apprentice. But either way, it's kind of like you pointed out, this whole opposite thing. I mean, whether the opposite is, where the by-the-book guy is the Master and the just like the renegade or whatever is the apprentice, or if it's vice versa, like in the case of Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, it's going to cause some problems.
Well, and to that point, that's my next coupling of that would have been Anakin and Ahsoka. This is why we're on a journey to Ahsoka, because getting to that a little bit, which we'll cover more in depth next with this coming Friday. But
yeah,
the thing is that because Anakin was such a wild card, Ahsoka also being a wild card.
Yeah, so well, that's it.
Anakin had kind of had to temper himself a little bit, because he realized, well, she keeps calling him out like, well, you do it. And he's like, yeah, but okay. He's like, you're right. But now he's trying to have to explain himself. And now he's realizing the effect that he's having on Ahsoka. So, but at the same time, he's like, all right, sometimes I have to implore Obi-Wan techniques, even though that's really not my style. He does understand why Obi-Wan says certain things. Now that
Well,
he has an apprentice of his own. So
yes.
you
And
also
that's
have that too.
precisely why Yoda did what he did. Because he
Hmm.
saw the problem, he saw that friction, he saw that weirdness, and he's like, okay, now we'll give Anakin this wild card that's kind of like him. And that's
Hmm.
going to, in a lot of ways, teach Anakin a little bit more control. And like, oh, I see why Obi-Wan, it kind of realizes that. And this is why, this is only the loophole of coming up with all that stuff and the Ahsoka character and everything after you do the prequels. Because if there's any weaknesses in Star Wars, I mean, besides the whole Disney, I mean, like there's Kathleen Kennedy. I mean, we could go on with that stuff. But I mean, if you're just talking about the weakness in the construct of these stories and how they were done, even from Lucas's own mind, because keep in mind that when all this stuff was going down, it was just Lucas and Filoni, right? It was still firmly under Lucas's control. But the problem is, whenever you have a franchise, any franchise, that starts to age, it becomes 30, 40, 50 years old, right? And you're basically retrofitting, you're adding on to it. It really becomes difficult not to paint yourself in a corner. And this is a perfect example of it, because if Lucas had actually created even just episode 3 with the back of his mind having that whole Anakin Ahsoka relationship, it probably would have changed a few things. Because fortunately, he kept it vague enough in episode 3 that it wasn't too bad, because Anakin was definitely calmer. And most of the problems that Anakin had during episode 3 was really more feeling undervalued and being a pawn in this game between Palpatine and the Council. So it does somewhat fit neatly in there, but these are the kinds of things you have to be careful, because I think that, Yoda did this on purpose, and I think that it would have just been a natural thing if maybe that could have been acknowledged a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, and with people doing things on purpose, the other big point that I want to kind of bring up just a bit is that Qui-Gon, I mean, yeah, Qui-Gon was a bigger threat to Palpatine
Yes.
because Palpatine wanted Anakin, but he knew that, okay, it's going to be harder to get him away from Qui-Gon. So that's why he dispatched Maul to kind of deal with those two. So he can kind of hopefully at least get one, and I mean, he was
I don't
hoping for
know
both.
about that yet. I don't know, because at that time, I don't know if he was really on Palpatine's radar that much during the Phantom Menace. Because even at the end, after all that's said and done, he was like, "Oh, Skywalker, we'll watch your career with interest." It's like you can tell. It's like, all
Hmm.
right, I want to see, because I heard this kid single-handedly blew up all of my guys, in a
Well,
spaceship.
he
Probably got the
probably sensed
midi-chlorian
them.
count. He might have. He might have.
He probably knew about Anakin, honestly, because you know, because once again, Padme being a senator from his home planet, she more than likely probably discussed it. Like, oh yeah, we met this boy, and he's going to be trained as a Jedi, and you know he won his pod race for us, and he's like, she's probably regaling people these stories, and he's probably like, pod race, a kid, okay, that's unusual. And he's going to be trained as a
Yeah, I just
Jedi.
don't know if
That's going to
it's.
spark interest for him,
It is, but I
especially.
don't know. But I don't know if it's at the standpoint of, I got to get this kid away from Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan's influence. I don't know if it's that strong yet. Episode 2, yeah, without question. But that's because he had like 10 years to get to know him.
Yeah, well, I think what it was is that I think he really did sense that, and he kind of was like, all right, you know, I'll just dispatch Maul to deal with him and get me this kid. And then now it's like, all right, well, of course, when he makes the line at the end of the movie, when he's like, oh, well, we'll watch your career with great interest. That's just him being Palpatine the
Maybe.
politician.
I honestly don't think that he gave a crap about him at all during episode 1. Because if you think about it, even all during episode 1, Palpatine was never around. He wouldn't have heard any of these stories until after that whole Maul Qui-Gon Obi-Wan duel. They were still out doing their thing. It wasn't like they really got, they got to the Jedi Council and they said, oh, okay, we can train or whatever. But it wasn't like there wouldn't have been any real time to do this yet. Because the idea is that over the 10-year period, that's when Palpatine actually saw, hey, this kid's like, and then he decided to become like a father figure to him. But
well,
at
I was
the time
more
of
referring to the
time
second
of,
part, the second duel, not the original one. But I hear you.
which second one?
So they had the duel when they were in the sand, when they were on Tatooine.
Yeah, but I mean, Palpatine wasn't even aware of any of that stuff yet. I mean, if you really stop and think about it, they only stopped at the Jedi Council long enough to go, well, we think he should be trained. Yeah, no, we're not going to train him. In fact, that's where it was left. We're not even going to train him. And then they took him out, and then they went back and, tried to do that whole, freeing Naboo thing. But, I mean, it wasn't even a thing. He wasn't even going to be on Palpatine's radar at that point. It wasn't until after the duel happened. That's when he would have had a chance to actually hear about any of these stories. I mean, if you go back and rewatch The Phantom Menace, it was a very quick little exchange, and then they were off again. It wasn't like they stood anywhere. I mean, about the only thing that I could say that maybe you can make that argument. Again, I don't feel it's all that strong, but is the midi-chlorian thing. Because he actually beamed the results or whatever back to the council, I guess. Well, even then he didn't really. He just was like, okay, he took the sample or whatever. I don't even know if he had a chance to send it anywhere yet. He was just doing that because he was trying to confirm his own suspicions. So, I mean...
possibly. We don't know, but it's a possible. It's a working theory. Let me just say that.
Well, I mean, let me put it this way. If you really go back and watch it, it really isn't any kind of a thing. On the other hand, if Kathleen Kennedy decided to be stupid and shoehorn that in there somehow, there's room, I guess, because that's the problem with Star Wars. It's actually one of the great things, but it's also one of the problems. You take something like Star Trek, it's very, very sci-fi. So the minutia is very, very important. Whereas with Star Wars, it's kind of like broad strokes. There's different things, there's room to shoehorn things in there. Sometimes it's for good, sometimes it's for bad. But David basically says, which teaching philosophy do you all agree with more, Obi-Wan or Qui-Gon? That was where I was saying, like, Qui-Gon probably has more the right idea, because Qui-Gon was the one, it's probably why you went with him as your choice. But Qui-Gon is the one who essentially was like, look, Jedi Council are getting a little bit too rigid. They're not allowing, they're just going, this is like this blanket statement, right? I mean, Qui-Gon looks at things very circumstantially and tries to employ what is right or what is best at that time. Whereas his whole problem is that, because Obi-Wan even said, if you just basically towed the line, you'd be on the council by now. But Qui-Gon can't do that, right? Let's see.
Yeah. I think Qui-Gon is still my favorite option. Just because I think he understands not just the Jedi and looking at things just individually, but I think he also just has a better grasp of humanity.
Well, I would say the big picture.
Yeah. Of humanity, though. It's like, the whole, like, all right, being able to make judgments, and he was, he was very wise, even though he comes off as a renegade, like, he would just drop little gems here and there. Like, even when he was talking to Jar Jar, which isn't really hard to sound intelligent, but when he said, the ability to speak does not make one intelligent, like just that, I was just like, wow.
I know.
Like that.
I mean, he had some gems in there. And that was the thing. It was sort of like his overall demeanor, everything like that. Qui-Gon,
he was
just
super calm.
He was super calm. He just always felt like he had everything in hand. And he just, when things would come up, he would just pivot. It wasn't like he would freak out about anything. However, where I would say that Obi-Wan had a little bit, because again, I would still make the argument that Obi-Wan was the greatest, which of course we'll get into later, because we sort of got derailed with some of these chats that we're doing. But Qui-Gon, he would be the one that I would have said was the greatest for a long time, and on the surface, I think it's more obvious that he is. But I think that if you really delve deep into it and you really take the entire lore, the entire franchise, everything into consideration, I think Obi-Wan edges him out. But at the same time, because one of the things that Obi-Wan, where I think that he actually made a really good, he was very complimentary for Qui-Gon, was he was skeptical. He wasn't just so trusting and just so, Obi-Wan's the guy that's going to be like, well, wait a second. If we do this, let's think this through a little bit, And so there were definitely things that at this point in time, because again, when you're dealing with Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, if you're dealing with the master and apprentice, I don't know, I think that was like 10 years or something, 5 years. I don't remember how long before the Phantom Menace it was. I mean, it wasn't like Obi-Wan was 10, but he also wasn't that old. I mean, the Phantom Menace, he's 19. So, you really, if you're looking at this, okay, who was better, at least when you're comparing them together, because obviously you can take their whole careers, even though, again, we don't have a whole lot of information about Qui-Gon really before the Phantom Menace. So there's not a whole lot we can look at. But
do you think if Qui-Gon never died, Obi-Wan was okay? Well, first of all, let's look at this. Let me ask you this question, because they're kind of a pair. So, do you feel like if Qui-Gon would have never died, do you feel like Obi-Wan would have surpassed him?
Yeah. Because Obi-Wan, thing that's funny is that
you picked Obi-Wan too, so I want to hear your spiel on Mr. Kenobi. Why do you choose Mr. Kenobi?
Because if you look at, and again, it's important to look at the totality. Yes, if you just look at the films and he's getting like dispatched by Dooku or Palpatine in like 20 seconds, and then Anakin has to go and fight him, you're going to kind of look and go, I don't know. But you have to look at a few things. Number one, as far as fighting, Obi-Wan actually was the master at a lot of these defensive lightsaber styles. Mm-hmm. He was actually known as one of the most devastating Jedi in the Jedi Order. And Sith, in particular, feared against going against him, as well as other lightsaber combatants, because they just could not get past Obi-Wan's defenses. And then Obi-Wan also used a lot of defense as offense, which of course confused everybody. So he was actually known as one of the most deadly combatants in the Jedi Order. You look at how he was during the Clone Wars. You look at just how formidable he was in a lot of things. He had a certain amount of wisdom. He was actually more well-rounded than Qui-Gon. I mean, even if you want to make the argument, because, there's a throwaway line in the Phantom Menace novel that says, oh, he was one of the greatest swordsmen in the Jedi Order. But it's like, well, at that time, while Obi-Wan was a Padawan, what about when Obi-Wan was full-fledged Jedi Knight and then Jedi Master? When you look at the grasp that Obi-Wan had over the Force, over a lot of the stuff, and then, of course, how he went on to train Luke, and just I think he was just more well-rounded, and he was able to pick up, different discipline. I mean, he even defeated Grievous by using a blaster. He could think on his feet. He actually had a certain amount of detective skill. So there's a lot of things that he obviously got from Qui-Gon, because of course Qui-Gon was sort of known for this in the beginning. But I just think that if you look at everything in totality, especially how devastating Obi-Wan was during the Clone Wars, his piloting skills, which of course Qui-Gon still counted on, because even then it was kind of like, well, Obi-Wan's like the pilot guy, right? He knows how to do all that stuff. So I just think if you just look at it, if I'm going to go into battle, I want Obi-Wan with me. I mean, really, I want Anakin with me, but but, and of course Anakin, and he and Anakin made this like devastatingly great team. And again, that's not to take anything away from Obi-Wan or Qui-Gon. I always thought that Qui-Gon was amazing too. In fact, he was really one of my favorite, especially as Liam Neeson played him. I thought he was easily one of the greatest. Like, as soon as he was introduced, there's very few characters that you can point to that are like this, but as soon as he was introduced, you're like, well, this guy's amazing. Kylo Ren was kind of like that to me too. As soon as Kylo Ren comes on, I'm like, all right, this is actually a really cool spin on a villain. And I really like the fact that Qui-Gon represented a different kind of Jedi at the time. Now, granted, we've had Jedi since that are kind of like him, but he was still the template, though. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Let me see. Let me get some more of these chats. Ronaldo. He's going back to when we were talking about Padme and her pregnancy. He says, I wonder, did they try to hide that pregnancy for 9 months?
Pretty much.
Well, kind of. I mean, if you actually look at episode 3 very closely, she's wearing some very oversized gowns, and being that she's from Naboo, a lot of people would be like, all right, I guess that's just one of her funky little, dresses or something. But really, it was actually 2 bundles of joy, right?
Yes, a little moo-moo.
I mean, bad dialogue notwithstanding, and, a lot of the other stuff. And, oh, man, you know what? Just go back to our What is Star Wars, watch our Revenge of the Sith review. We cover a lot of that stuff. David says, I'm thinking of a person, and he's a liar and a manipulator. It's not the greatest of all time. It's Obi-Wan. Perhaps Daryl is correct for a change, and Taken is better. Oh, man, David, you're just killing me with these things.
I know.
That's awesome. It's funny, because when I first saw the movie Taken, right, I kept imagining, like, what if Qui-Gon had that? Well, yeah, it's kind of like, if he just started using those lines, like the Taken lines, but in Star Wars.
Oh, yeah. That'd be hilarious.
Or like Qui-Gon was more like that. Yeah.
Yeah, like,
exactly.
I have a special set of skills.
Yeah. I will find you and I will kill you, if he was talking to like Maul or something. I mean, that would have been awesome. Like after that whole like desert fight scene or whatever, if he had just basically called up Maul and just said, listen, I got a special set of skills. I'm going to find you and then I'm going to kill you. I mean, that would have been awesome.
I mean, a very dark side of him. But
well, yeah.
But yeah. Here's the thing about Obi-Wan. Like, I think Obi-Wan is a fantastic character. I think he's he's a prime example of intent versus impact. Like, I think his intent, of course, was to train Luke and, do all that he could to ensure, like, okay, he's going to be the hope that we're looking for. And kind of almost lost it. He kind of almost blew it, honestly. I mean, and it's weird. But I just feel like Qui-Gon just had a better way of teaching and dealing with different types of people, where I feel like Obi-Wan struggled with that.
Well, Obi-Wan, I think, struggled with that more so in the beginning. Because if you juxtapose the way that he handled Anakin versus the way he handled Luke, I think he was way more... Because if you look at the episode 4, and maybe 5 and 6, if you want to count them as Force Ghosts, Obi-Wan had a very... You could tell he was wise. Now he was at that Qui-Gon level. Maybe even more so. Because one of the things that I think that was really tricky about the predicament that Obi-Wan was in was that he knew that Luke was going to have questions about his father. He knew, obviously, the truth about what happened. So he didn't want to out and out lie to him. Because even though, people say he's a liar, he wasn't a liar. What he said was true from a certain point of view, as Obi-Wan himself pointed out. And, you could say, okay, that's a little bit cheap, but you also have to look at why he did that. Was because he knew that in order to fulfill his destiny, he had to destroy Vader. He had to kill Vader. That was how he was going to become a Jedi. That's how he was going to swing the balance of power. Now, it's kind of weird to me, just as a little side note, that they never say anything about the Emperor. It wasn't like they didn't know the Emperor was alive, because they kept telling him, don't underestimate him. But killing the Emperor, might have been a little bit of a lofty goal, but I mean, it's sort of like killing Vader, facing Vader and then killing him. That was going to be the difficult thing. If he had the knowledge that that's his father, he's going to do exactly what he did. He's going to try to turn him. That may or may not work. Vader can then use it against him, which of course he tried to do, because Vader, look, he basically was more twisted and evil by that point. And that's one of the things that I thought was really cool about the Obi-Wan series, by the way, is that for some of the problems that it had, I love the dialogue between that final duel between Vader when, he basically cut a piece of the mask and you could see a little bit of Anakin in there, and sure, it was kind of a fan servicey retcon that might have been a little bit on the nose, but if you just leave all that at the door and just really focus on what he was saying, Anakin was just like, look, you didn't kill me. I killed Anakin. I am now Vader. I am this guy. The person that you knew no longer even exists. And that horrifying feeling that the audience had, if you allowed yourself to feel that and overlook some of the issues, really gives you that sense of urgency on why Obi-Wan was like, look, we got to get Luke to basically end this guy. And he's not going to do it if he knows it's his father, so we have to maybe bend the truth a little bit here.
I don't know though, and that's my. And don't get me wrong. Fortunately, we all know it worked out in the end.
Sure,
but if you think about it, if this guy is like, okay, all right, this guy, you mean to tell me this guy Darth Vader is if Obi-Wan would have told him who he was out the gate, like, the guy Darth Vader that's been running around blowing up planets, and they didn't know they blew up a planet yet, but the guys who've been running around terrorizing everybody, like, yeah, that's your dad. Like, okay, like, now he's never met him. He doesn't even know what he looks like. I think it'd be hard to, I think it would be easier for him to go up and kill him, and because I don't even know who you are. I don't have an attachment to you.
You have forgotten a very, very big key scene in episode 4. You have to remember that Luke was obsessed with his father. He looked up to him. Remember the dinner conversation with Uncle Owen? And he kept pressing him because he had all the stories about all this stuff, and Owen was trying to be like, no, he was a spice freighter, not a Jedi hero, not the guy you think he is. Luke had this romantic view of who his dad was because he had heard a bunch of stories that, of course, Owen was trying to just be like, nope, not true, normal guy, spice freighter, it's like, but he wouldn't do it. And that's that's the reason why I think, and look, Obi-Wan had been with him. I mean, the implication was that Obi-Wan, old Ben, right, had been around and had been with him, and of course knew how Luke romanticized his father. So there's like no way in the world that, I mean, first of all, have you been like, yeah, that guy you've been idolizing? Yeah, he's kind of an evil guy. You know that Darth Vader guy that's been running around? Yeah, that's him. First of all,
Well, that's what I'm saying though. It's like, okay, if you think about it, like, okay, if you had like this guy that was, it's almost like if your dad was like this military war hero, and then
you
you've heard all these stories like, oh
find
yeah,
out
and
he's
then you
fighting for
find out
the
like,
other side.
or you finally he gets out of the military, he's becoming this big drug lord or something like that, and he's like poisoning communities and he's killing kids and smacking women all over the place, and he's just become this rotten individual, but you've never even seen him, you've never even met him. So you have both sides of the equation. Like, you were once this great guy, but then something happened
But
along the
don't
way where you
forget, though, don't forget Cobra Kai. I knew I'd find a way to
oh
bring this
boy.
in. Well, I mean, but think about it. That's exactly what Miguel was thinking. And instead of listening to his mom, who tried to tell him, look, your father was a monster. He was horrible. We had to get away from him. He just couldn't believe it, because you can't believe that about your dad until you see it for yourself. And the problem is, if Luke had gone and tried to see it for himself, and Vader then would have had this plan like, oh yeah, got a kid? You strong in the Force? It would have been easier to turn him to the dark side, because then he would have been in like dad pleasing mode. It's very similar to the whole Miguel thing. I mean, one of the things I loved about that Cobra Kai story arc in season 5 was the fact that it pretty much played out how, in a lot of cases, it normally would have. He was all about it until he saw his father actually doing stuff and beating up Johnny and all this. Then it's finally like, all right, I guess mom was right about him. But see, by then it would have been too late, though.
Okay, but then like when you see what happens like in Empire, it's like, okay, he goes up, and now he still kind of runs into the same problem though, because it's like, okay, now
But he
he
has
eventually does
background,
it,
though. It's
but he's
true.
like, okay, I've I know the truth. Now I have this guy that I've actually fought. He lopped off my hand. Like, you know,
But here's
and,
the thing.
and
He's
then he's
facing
trying to
him
get me to.
after he's had training. If he had gone, if Obi-Wan had just told him the truth right out the gate, Luke would have gone to seek him out. If Luke had sought him out before he even knew what the Force was, he would have been killed instantly. Because even the Emperor was just like, listen, the offspring of Anakin Skywalker can't live. And Vader would have been okay with that at that point, because he didn't even know that Luke was really all that strong in the Force. You know, Vader started getting that idea in his head when he found out that Luke was the one that blew up the Death Star. And then, of course, he found out his name, which, I mean, I still, to this
Yeah, I
day,
know.
I don't know why they didn't change his name. On his home
Well,
planet, mind you. It's...
here's the thing though. It's like, I think Vader would have tried to save. I think Vader would have tried to. I don't think Vader would have killed him if Luke would have came. I was like, "Hi, I'm Luke Skywalker. I'm here to see Darth Vader." And it's just like, and
like
Vader
his
comes out.
secretary or something.
Perry, exactly. Like, hold on, he's in a meeting,
Yeah.
but he'll be out in a
Right,
second.
yeah, exactly. He's choking Admiral Mahdi right now. Hang on a second.
But he's putting his helmet on. Don't give him a second. And
Yeah,
then
right. Little bariatric chamber.
so he comes out, and it's like, okay, yeah. I think Vader instantly would have been like, wait. He probably would have sensed it and been like, wait, okay, you're my
Sensed it?
kid.
He didn't even sense that Leia was his kid, and he spent a lot of time with her.
Well, yeah, but that's
And she
because
was
at
using
least,
the Force, much the same way Luke was. Luke may not have had the training, but he was still using the Force to, destroy womp rats, and he was kind of like, yeah, I am kind of a good pilot. I don't know. I guess I'm just naturally good at this. And then Leia, of course, is naturally good at politics and diplomacy.
yeah, but I mean, like, I think if you look at it from the standpoint of if Luke would have walked up to Vader and said, "I'm Luke Skywalker," like, first of all, Skywalker doesn't seem to be a very common name, like you said. So it's like, okay, and then
I hope it
you
is,
know,
honestly.
and then he's like, well, where are you from? Tatooine. Okay, that's just too much of a coincidence at that point. So then it's
Red
like, okay, wait,
flag.
and he already, and let's face it, at this point, he already didn't trust the Emperor anyway because he already knew that he got duped. So
Yes,
Vader will
but
probably investigate.
he may not have known though. I mean, I guess the only thing that I could say that might lend some credence to this is he might have imprisoned him, and he might have tried to force him to try to use the Force to see if he was powerful. Because by this point in time, he had already recruited Starkiller. So he was in the mindset of, hey, I need to find somebody that's going to help me overthrow the Emperor. But he didn't really get that into his head, though, what I'm saying, canonically. He didn't get that into his head until, one, Luke demonstrated his power, and the Force and all that by blowing up the Death Star against all odds.
Now,
and then a
I
few
have
other
question
things.
about that. Was Vader actually feeling him? Was he feeling Obi-Wan? That sounds so
No, him.
creepy. When I
Totally
said
him. Well, I know. I'm letting it go. I'm trying to just overlook that
wanna
part
say,
of the
I
question.
want to say Paul so bad.
Ooh, a presence
No,
I
but
haven't
look,
felt since I was 8, and
but
there was
no.
that incident.
Hey there, Marshall, huh? But no,
Yeah, exactly. That little incident in the
well, no,
Jedi Temple.
but no. Think about it though. Like, okay, he's flying this whole mission, right? And then, like, right when it's his turn to actually, start his run, that's when Obi-Wan wants to start talking to him.
He started
So
talking
my
to him, but
thing,
he basically just said, look, trust your feelings. Luke is the one that did all the work.
yeah, but I mean, like,
he's like, getting out of the way of. It wasn't like Obi-Wan was controlling him. Not to mention, this is all what Lucas was saying
He could have
during
been
the thing
influencing
anyway.
him.
No, and that
He
was the
wasn't
thing that
influencing him?
Lucas
Okay.
even was saying during the commentary, was the fact that that was when he got on Vader's radar. And by the way, this is further corroborated in the recent comic book series that had come out, where Vader was actually one of the coolest story arcs that I think I read in the comics, was that Vader was super angry at the fact that nobody told him that it was this Luke Skywalker guy. Like, as soon as he found that out, he just went in instantly and started, like, killing off all these people that had hid that from him. Because people hid that from him.
Yeah.
So he went in, first thing he did was kill all those people. Then he started going on this manhunt for Luke, basically. It's what the whole comic series was about. And that's when he ran into Dorme, and, I mean, it actually gets really, really cool, because then there's this whole thing where he doesn't really want to kill Dorme because Padme liked her, and at the same time, he kind of wants to. If you guys haven't read that, it's actually a very fascinating comic series. It was a comic series that was released last year. I think they changed, like story arcs or whatever in the Vader comic series. But that was really, really cool. And that was when he got on the radar that it was Luke. And then it was talking about how he put it in his mind that, oh, yeah, that X-Wing pilot obviously was strong in the Force because he was able to evade his lasers. And, Vader, of course, was using the Force to target the X-Wings in the first place. So he had to have been strong in the Force to evade him, because it's more or less eclipsing Vader's use of it. It's almost like if Vader went to Force choke somebody, and somebody used the Force to block that Force choke, you'd have to be pretty strong in the Force to do that. And it was the same kind of thing. So I thought it was really cool that they actually started expanding that storyline quite a bit. And that's what put him on Vader's radar. And that's when Vader was like, all right, I got to find this guy, because this guy's my ticket to killing the Emperor. So it's kind of how that went down. At least in the new canon. Let's see what else we got chat-wise here. Ronaldo says, I think Palpatine knew about the Chosen One, but had no idea it was Anakin at first. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that too, because look, the Chosen One prophecy was not some, I mean, it's fairly common knowledge, right? I mean, Dooku was
Mhm.
researching it at one point. It was kind of a Jedi thing. Now, I don't know how much stock though. This is actually an interesting question because I don't know how much credence Palpatine would have been given to what he would have probably dismissed as a Jedi superstition. I mean, do you think that Palpatine, excuse me, you think Palpatine really
Oh no, I
thought
don't think he
anything of it?
dismissed it at all. Oh no, I definitely thought he did. I think that's because once again he knew that okay, if there's this chosen one out here and Dooku's been bringing all this research, he's probably told Palpatine about that as well
I would
at
think
some
so.
point.
Yeah.
And then Palpatine is definitely going to investigate that. I mean, look, he's hearing stuff about whispers or about the unknown regions and all types of stuff. So it's like he's going to investigate certain things because he likes that's part of his power is the fact that he knows everything. He's kind of like a hub for all information, which is why he wanted to ascend to becoming the emperor because not all things have to kind of funnel through him.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like anything that transpires, I want to know about
Yeah.
it. So
Well, that's true.
and
Yeah.
and like you
Yeah.
said, anything that's a threat to, especially a threat to him.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, I want to know about this.
Yep. No, that's a good point. Ronaldo goes on to say, I agree with Qui-Gon. He's a chill dude. Yeah, of course he's a chill dude. Then he says, Obi-Wan defeated Grievous, Darth Maul twice, and Vader twice. These are also actually very, very strong points. I mean, Qui-Gon kind of got stabbed in the chest by Maul by fighting him. Well, he did. He technically fought him twice, but
Well, yeah,
look
and
at how fast he dispatched Maul. Look at how powerful Obi-Wan was in the Force by the time Maul faced him just before Episode 4. I mean, that's the thing too. I mean, when you really
Obi-Wan was kind of reacting off emotion too, though.
well, kind of. I mean, he sort of knew that it was going to happen, and to be fair, I mean, if you really want to equalize these things out, is that at this point in time, Maul was no longer a Sith Lord, although he was still incredibly powerful in the Force. Everybody forgets that. I mean, just
Yeah,
look at how he
but
ran, Crimson Dawn.
yeah, but I mean, the thing is with Maul though is I don't want to say he used a dirty trick, but it's like as skilled as Obi-Wan was, as far as lightsaber combat, um, fighting someone like with a double bladed lightsaber, it's not always the easiest thing to do. So it's like the fact that Maul was able to kind of, and like I said, Maul, it's not like Maul was able to beat him really like just straight on. He had to do that to beat Qui-Gon.
Well, if you think about it, the way that he defeated Qui-Gon was he kicked him in the gut and then stabbed him.
No, he hit him in the chin. He used the middle of the hilt and hit him in the chin, which just distracted him for a second. So his eyes were up, and then he stabbed him.
But
So
Obi-Wan,
that's what
on
I'm
the
saying.
other
Like
hand, which by the way
he cut the.
negates. I always thought there was a weird line when Obi-Wan was like, and actually that those pitch meeting videos I had sent you, that was one of the things that they brought up for oh, what would it have been? I guess it would have been it was episode 3, right? Where Obi-Wan's like, I have the high ground. It's like, okay, like I'm up on a hill. It's like, but what I find funny is that actually Maul had the high ground when Obi-Wan beat him. In fact,
Well,
Obi-Wan was like in a
that,
very precarious position when that happened. He launched himself up with the Force, flipped over him, called his lightsaber to him, and sliced Maul in half.
mhm. That's because Maul dropped his guard. He became arrogant.
Uh-huh.
Just saying.
Next, you're going to say that Qui-Gon could have stood against Vader. Although, I think that the common denominator between Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan against Vader, which I think a lot of people actually forget about, to be honest, is that as much
What?
as Vader was really far gone, there was still more emotion involved fighting Obi-Wan. You know, it wasn't like because you see all these things where Vader just quickly dispatches all these guys because he doesn't care. With
Mm-hmm.
Obi-Wan, though, there's a little bit of the caring thing. There's a little bit of that, that hatred, which is still, of course, an emotion. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, Vader becomes a little bit weaker if he fights against these people. Because let's face it, that was Anakin's weakness as a Jedi, too. He would get really cranked up and emotional. That's one of the things that Obi-Wan tried to tell him, like, dude, stop.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing I would say about Obi-Wan, though, and like I said, super powerful guy. One thing I can say about Obi-Wan is he was a brilliant strategist. Like
Mhm.
he always looked for the advantage. He never was in a rush for things. He was kind of steady in the pace. He was always talking about patience, and just not rushing into things.
That's a
And
good
you got
point.
to see that on numerous occasions, especially in the Clone Wars
Yeah.
animated series. You got a chance to see that a whole lot. And he always had these little, even on the Obi-Wan series, when he tricked Vader, when he had him thinking that they were all on one ship and the other ship was behind it. So when Vader stopped that one from taking off, he saw that as a chance. Okay, now's our chance. Let's blast out of here. Just
I almost
because he
felt
knows
bad for
Anakin
Vader
so.
on that one.
I
Like
know,
I,
me
I
too.
actually felt bad. Like, I mean, that was what
I
was so
did.
funny about that. I'm like, man.
He had that look. He had that
Yeah,
look like he was
no.
watching. Now he was like, "Son of a!" Like that's
Yep.
kind of like
That same look that he kind of had after Rogue One, too, where the ship gets away and he was almost there. And somebody was getting force choked or cut in half on that one. Ronaldo says, I have a particular set of skills. I have a midi-chlorian count test. He said they should have changed his name to Duke Groundwalker. Yeah, well, I mean, I always thought it was a little strange. It's like, all right, man, you're trying to hide this kid. Now, I sort of get the hiding in plain sight thing on Tatooine. I mean, in a weird way, that makes sense because it's the one place that Vader would never go back to.
right.
And being that it's sort of on the outer rim and the Hutts had the controls and all that stuff, that one, I'll be like, okay, cool. But why couldn't he have been Luke Lars? I mean, Leia became Leia Organa, right? When she was adopted. She wasn't Leia Skywalker. Luke could have been Luke Lars. I mean, that would have made perfect sense. Nobody would have thought anything of it. And here's the thing that really kills me. Because if you really stop and think about these things, it becomes even funnier. He was trying to join the Imperial Academy. Can you imagine when he goes and fills out that application and it's Luke Skywalker?
Well, one of the other little things that I always thought that was weird was that, okay, so I get the fact that, okay, Luke, Obi-Wan was watching over Luke, as he was growing up, and he would kind of like, make his appearances here and there.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's like, okay, so when Obi-Wan finally decides to like, okay, you must learn the ways of the Force if you were to come with me to Alderaan, and he's like, okay, cool. I go. His parent, Uncle Owen and Beru end up, on the barbecue, so to speak. And so then now they're off to the Death Star. They get stuck on the Death Star. Vader cuts down, or Vader. It looks like Vader cuts down Obi-Wan when he doesn't really, but Luke is so overwhelmed with the emotion, and I'm just kind of like, why? It's not like this guy was like an integral part of your life like that.
We kind
Like, I
of
could see if
was,
that was
though.
Lars.
Well, no, but I mean,
When?
it was implied that, yeah, I know what you're saying because it's kind of like, I wonder if you mean old Ben. It's like, it's very vague because if you hear Lucas tell it, it was like Obi-Wan became that confidant, because Owen didn't understand him. He was like that. I mean, that's what made the whole Herbert is Obi-Wan and Chris is Luke thing so hilarious, because it's kind of the same thing in the sense of,
This creepy old man is
yeah,
hanging out
this
with this
creepy
teenage
old
kid.
dude that's hanging with this teenage kid. It was sort of like he was the, kind of like the one who understands him. In fact, and I just thought of this, but if you really want to draw the parallel, it was very much the Palpatine-Anakin relationship, honestly. Because, when Owen didn't understand, Ben did. He was the one that would, tell him about this stuff. He was the one that would be, I guess, somewhat truthful or whatever. He was the one that basically had Luke's confidence and everything else. Now, of course, you get glimpses of this a little bit, although they're never really... They're only now starting to fill in the gaps and confirm a lot of this stuff, I think. But, I know what you mean, though, because if you just look at it from a viewer standpoint, right? Because, again, especially when I first saw this back in 77, now we made those assumptions. We did. I mean, full disclosure, we all made the assumptions that Obi-Wan and Luke were close. And Owen hated the fact that they were close because obviously Obi-Wan was telling him about how great his dad was. Which, think about it, is kind of counterproductive, considering it's like, oh yeah, I want him to kill this guy. It seems like that would be the time to, maybe tell him what a schmuck he was, right? But didn't really do that. One of the many things in Star Wars that didn't make sense. But I could also understand somebody else maybe making the argument, like, look, he knew this guy for 10 minutes, and now you're all broken up over his death. So
yeah, I mean, I think he was just trying to. I think he was just telling him stories about his dad to inspire him to want to be like Anakin, not Vader.
Yeah,
and that's why he's like, oh, okay, well, you could be a powerful Jedi like your dad was, and
right.
He's like, oh yeah,
and then go kill this guy Darth Vader, because Darth Vader is the one that killed your father, and yeah, exactly. It's groom him. Start him young. But, yeah, speaking of, because I know we got to wrap this up now, but, before we get to our final thoughts, much like Obi-Wan was grooming Luke, let me groom our audience real quick here. Besides, of course,
coming.
Yeah, of course. If you guys like this kind of Star Wars discussion, if you want to be a part of it, hey, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. If that's all you guys do, that's really appreciated. But if you guys want to go a step further, you can either make a one-time donation, give us a tip basically, buy us a coffee, and maybe join one of these packages. For $5 a month, you could be a Padawan, Jedi Knight at $10 a month, Jedi Master at $25 a month. You get a few perks if you do that, eventually. And, we really appreciate the support. It definitely goes a long way in helping us bring this show to you guys twice a week. As again, we do want to expand it. And of course, we have the Discord server. The link is in the description. Become a part of that. You can hang out with us when we're not doing this on Monday and Friday. So, I like David. David, you're like our co-promoter, buddy. I love it. He says, the coffee is delicious. Buy a couple. Yes. Dear David, you listen. Ronaldo chats in and says, oh, the reason Vader couldn't sense Luke is obvious. It was the will of the Force. Well, yeah, of course. That's what we all have to lean on, right? I mean, everything is the will of the Force if we can't explain it. Or if Lucas decides not to give us an explanation. Although, that whole midi-chlorian episode that we did a week or two ago, I mean, that actually came from that crazy encyclopedia thing. I'm almost tempted to buy that thing now because it makes me think, what other information is in there that we don't know? I mean, who knows? It could even give us topic ideas. But all right, to close it out, you have any final thoughts on this? Anything you want to say to the people that are watching?
I'm still rocking with Qui-Gon. I think that overall, as a swordsman, he was renowned. Um, he went up against some of the best in the Jedi Order. I think he had a better grasp on um, teaching students and dealing with them. Um, and I also feel like he would have, had he lived, any longer, I think he definitely would have grown even further and definitely would have been on the council and probably been like the number 3 guy, probably next to like Mace.
I can see that. Or, I
Um,
mean, look, I would even settle for, could we just get some more comics, novels, whatever, that just feature him? And let's get some
yeah.
more Qui-Gon into the lore. Again, I mean, I'm still sticking with Obi-Wan just because evidentiary, we just have all this evidence before us. I mean, look at what Obi-Wan has done. He's had a much longer career. But, I mean, again, I could go either way on this. In fact, in full disclosure, before we actually went live tonight, I was prepared to go for Qui-Gon. But, I don't know, I just started thinking about it, and then, also to make it a little bit more interesting, a little devil's advocate, a little head-to-head, But then when I just started thinking about it, though, I just started thinking about, well, look, I've read a lot of these comics. I've read a lot of the novels, both expanded universe and the ones in the new canon, of course, the films. I mean, there's just a lot of evidence there that Obi-Wan really, even if you don't want to say that he's the best, I think if you want to say he's the most well-rounded, I think most people could maybe agree with that. But what I'm going to do, I meant to actually do this before we went live tonight, but what I'm going to do is when we get off tonight, I'm going to put a poll up. I want you guys to vote. Everybody that's chatted in tonight, anybody, of course, that's watching after the fact, take the poll, vote. Who was overall the best Jedi in your opinion? Was it Qui-Gon Jinn, as Daryl is suggesting? Or the right answer, was it... I'm just kidding.
Oh, okay. All right.
Or, was it Obi-Wan Kenobi? What do you guys
Trust me,
think?
these force powers out in a minute.
And, watch. So again, this Friday, it's going to be part 1 of our whole Journey to Ahsoka thing, where we're going to start delving into it. I think Friday's episode is going to be a little bit more on the Ahsoka-Sabine relationship and what maybe we can expect to see from that, because obviously they're expanding that quite a bit. There's a lot to deal with there. And then Monday, we'll start to unpack the Obi-Wan, or not Obi-Wan, I got Obi-Wan on the brain, the Ahsoka-Anakin relationship. And now that we've had some confirmation that Hayden Christensen is in it, there's obviously going to be some flashback scenes. Maybe there's a Force Ghost thing or two. We don't know yet. There could be some very interesting things there. And then, of course, on both Friday and Monday, as we're doing this part 1 and part 2 of Journey to Ahsoka, even though those are going to be the focuses of each night, I mean, look, we can go anywhere with this. So hopefully you guys are there to chat with us, join us, help us steer the conversation. Tell your friends. You guys are watching on Twitch. We really appreciate it. Again, we love our Twitch viewers. We're glad to be back on Twitch. Maybe share our channel. Boost it on Discord. Join us on Discord. We can keep the conversation going. Just a lot of opportunities to hang out and talk with us. Hey, you can even play Call of Duty with me. We've got a Call of Duty channel. It's on our Discord. I'm on most nights. Stop in, say hi, play a round or two. It'd actually be a lot of fun. So, till Friday, remember, hit the like, hit the subscribe button, take the poll that I'm going to put up in a few minutes. Buy us a coffee if you're so inclined. And until then, I'm Eric Vansel.
I'm Daryl Saunders.
May the Force be with you.
Always.
Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @HeadToHeadSW. Submit your questions for our next show. Visit our official website at headtoheadswpodcast.com. Until next time, may the Force be with you, always.